Please give a warm welcome to David McKnight.
All right, folks, tonight we're going to start off with a quiz. I hope they warned you. They sent you all the study material, right? Can anybody tell me the highest tax bracket in the history of our country? What's the worst it's ever been? What do you think? Yeah, so the last 2 years of World War II, the highest marginal tax bracket was 94%. And that was for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. So let's fast forward to the decade of the 70s. What was the worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay throughout the entire decade of the 70s? Now this one's easy to remember. Throughout the entire decade of the 70s, the worst federal marginal tax bracket you could pay was 70%. Once again, for any dollar you made above and beyond $200,000. Now let's fast forward to today. The truth is that tax rates today are just about as low as we've seen in our lifetime. However, something is going to happen in that tax bracket January 1st, 2026. Is it going to go up or is it going to go down? It's going to go up. And in order for that to happen, by the way, what is it going to go up to? It's going to go up to 39.6. And in order for that to happen, all Congress has to do is nothing. Is Congress pretty good at doing nothing? The real question I have for you, however, is this. What is likely to happen to tax rates beyond 2026 as we move forward in time to 2028, 2030, and beyond? What does your gut tell you? Are tax rates down the road likely to be higher or lower than 39.6? What do you think? Raise your hand if you think higher. All right, so that's just about everybody in the room. So my question for you is why? What are the big ticket items? Social Security, military. Well, the first thing we got to talk about is the debt. How much debt do we owe? 30 trillion, that's a 3 and a 0 followed by 12 zeros. Now, I'm not so much concerned about the debt as I am the interest on the debt, the cost of renting the money that we've already spent. We've got Medicare, we've got Medicaid, we've got Social Security. Here's an interesting one, pensions. The other day I was talking to a lady, I said, hey, what happens to your pension if your company goes broke? She says, don't worry, Dave, no matter what happens to my company, the federal government guarantees I will always receive 2/3 of my pension every year till I die. Folks, that's what we call an unfunded obligation. What's an unfunded obligation? It's a promise the federal government's made that they can't afford to keep. Some experts say that what the federal government's promised that they can't afford to pay is about $120 trillion. Can anybody tell me when Social Security was invented? When did they first roll out Social Security? And they rolled it out in 1935. And when Social Security first started out, how many workers were putting money into the program for every one person that took money out? What did that ratio look like? 10 to 1, 4 to 1? It was actually 42 to 1. Back then, how old did you have to be to draw on Social Security? 65. Anybody want to take a stab at what the average life expectancy was back then? It was 62. They didn't even anticipate that the average person would live long enough to ever draw on Social Security. If you were lucky enough to make it to 65, how long did you draw on Social Security before you tipped over dead? Just a couple years, right? Was Social Security pretty solvent when it first started out? You bet it was. It was set up to last forever. And then something happened. Soldiers came home from World War II, and they started to do something at a rate at which they'd never done it before. What did they start doing? Making babies. Thank you for the tasteful way in which you put that. They started to have children. In fact, if you look at demographic trends over the last 100 years or so, it looks a little bit like this. You start off at the turn of the century with what we call the Henry Ford generation. These are our World War II vets. What did Tom Brokaw call these folks? The greatest generation. They were followed up by what we call the silent generation, still sort of reeling from the Great Depression. Then what do we call this big statistical anomaly in the middle right here? Yeah, so these are the baby boomers. Now, did baby boomers have a few children of their own? They had a few. What do we call this? We call this Generation X. So I am a Generation Xer now, and we had children of our own. We call this Generation Y. I got 7 kids. That's exactly what I asked myself in the middle of the night. Now, as you look at this chart, did baby boomers, these folks in the middle, have nearly as many children as their parents did? No. Not even close. In fact, they had almost 30 million fewer children. So if you were to ask yourself today, how many workers are putting money into Social Security for every one person that takes money out, what does that ratio look like today? It's a little bit below 3 to 1. In another 10 years, what's that going to look like? 2 to 1. And what's the earliest you can draw on Social Security today? 62. And if you start at 62, how long will you continue to draw before you tip over dead? Try 23 years or until age 85. Folks, is Social Security today just a little bit different than when it first started out? You bet it is. It started off as insurance against living too long, and it slowly morphed into this pension program that covers us for nearly a quarter of our lives. Well, how many of you guys have ever heard of a guy named David Walker? Does that name ring a bell at all, David Walker? Okay, so David Walker was what we called the Comptroller General of the federal government. He was basically the CPA of the USA, and he did that for 10 years under Bush and Clinton. The reason I'm telling you this is because David Walker knows more about these numbers than just about anyone else on the planet. And he took one look at the books and he said, hey, we have promised way more than we can afford to keep. He says, you think Social Security is bad. He says, Medicare is 5 times more expensive. He said, to be able to deliver on these 2 promises alone, he said this in 2008, he said, we would have to double taxes immediately. He said, you don't have to double taxes immediately, but for every year that you postpone doubling taxes, the national debt will grow by $2 trillion per year on average, each and every year until we hit this magical moment in our country when we have $53 trillion of debt. Did you know that if we had $53 trillion of debt, that all of the revenue flowing into the US Treasury at that point under today's tax rates would only be enough to pay the interest on all that debt, let alone any principal, let alone a single dollar for Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, or anything else we listed on that screen. In fact, David Walker was so concerned about this that in 2008 he resigned and started to crisscross the country, raising the warning cry to whoever would listen. In 2010, he wrote a book called Come Back America, in which he sort of diagnosed the problem. And he appeared on NPR to talk about his book. And he told the radio show hostess, he said, hey, look, tax rates have to double or we're going to go broke. And she didn't believe him. So he says, look, I can give you one 4-letter word to explain why tax rates have to double. And does anybody know the 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double? Just yell it out. Math. Math is a 4-letter word that explains why tax rates have to double. What did David Walker mean by math? Well, basically what he's saying is saying, look, if this is what you're spending and this is what's coming in, you can either double what's coming in, cut in half what's going out, or some combination of the two. It's simple math. We have a massive freight train that's bearing down on us, and it's bearing down on us in the form of what? In the form of higher taxes. And we got a couple of choices of what we can do about it. We can pretend like the problem doesn't really exist. We can pretend like the math to which David Walker referred doesn't really add up. But isn't that a little bit like pulling down that window shade? Or we can implement some strategies starting right now that can help remove us from the train tracks, thereby insulating and buffering us from the impact of higher taxes. What I'm going to do is just give you an example. Mr. and Mrs. Jones, age 50, they want to retire in 15 years and they make $100,000 per year. Before we lay out the particulars of their example, I'm going to establish that there are 3 basic types of investments. And today we're going to talk about these investments in terms of buckets of money. The first bucket is what we call the taxable bucket, meaning every year as your money grows, you get to pay a tax. How do you know if you have a taxable investment? Well, every year the IRS sends you that little love letter. It's called a 1099. It says, hey, your money grew this much. Now you got to give a portion back to the IRS in the form of taxes. These are generally liquid investments, which means that they make for great emergency funds. What do financial experts tell us? We should have in our emergency funds about 6 months worth of basic living expenses. The second bucket is what we call the tax deferred bucket, meaning you don't pay taxes as your money grows. When do you pay the tax? At the very end, when you take the money out. What are some examples of some typical tax deferred investments? 401ks, IRAs, SEPs, Simples, 403bs. You guys get the idea. Now there's all sorts of different rules that apply to these investments, but generally speaking, they all have 2 things in common. First thing they have in common is when you put money in, you get a tax deduction. For example, you make $100,000 per year, you put $10,000 into your 401k. What's your new adjusted gross income? That's right, $90,000. Second thing they have in common is the manner in which they're taxed upon distribution. Now, the IRS has a special word that they use to characterize this income when you take it out. What do they call this income when you take it out? They call it ordinary income. Ordinary income, what does that mean? That means that when you put money into your 401k, at what tax rate are you taxed when you take that money out? At whatever tax rates happen to be in the year you take that money out. So folks, isn't that a little bit like going into a business partnership with the IRS? And every year the IRS gets a vote on what percentage of your profits they get to keep. Does that sound like a good business partnership to anyone? So you could have $1 million in your IRA, But unless you can accurately predict what tax rates are going to be in the year you take that money out, do you really know how much money you have? The answer is no. And it's pretty hard to plan for retirement if you don't know how much money you have. And the third bucket we're going to talk about is what we call the tax-free bucket. Now, there's all sorts of different investments out there that masquerade as tax-free, but I'm here to tell you to be truly tax-free, it's got to qualify in two different ways. The first way is it's got to really be tax-free. When I say tax-free, I'm talking free from three different types of taxes: free from federal tax, free from state tax, and free from capital gains tax. The second thing we're looking for in a true tax-free investment is when you take money out, it should not count as provisional income. What counts as provisional income? Well, any distributions or any 1099s from your taxable bucket count as provisional income. Any distributions at all from your tax-deferred bucket count as provisional income, and 1/2 of your Social Security counts as provisional income. So the IRS adds all this provisional income up, and if as a single person, it adds up to more than $34,000. Or if as a married couple, it adds up to more than $44,000, then guess what? Up to 85% of your Social Security can become taxable to you at your highest marginal tax bracket. All right, everybody pretty much in a good mood by now? Okay, so what we're going to do in the balance of our time is I'm simply going to give you an example. So let's say Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $500,000 in their IRA in the tax-deferred bucket. They've got $100,000 in some plain old taxable mutual funds in the taxable bucket. That's their emergency fund. They're putting 10% into their 401k, but they're getting no match, no company match, no free money. And they're putting $2,000 per year into some term life insurance, and they're putting $4,000 per year into some long-term care insurance. Now, if this couple were to walk into a traditional tax-deferred Paradigm Financial Advisor's office, how would the conversation go? Mr. and Mrs. Jones, congratulations. They always congratulate you. You're doing great. Problem is, last year when you were down the road at XYZ Company, you only earned 7%. We think we can get you 8%. So roll all that money over to us. As far as your mutual funds, that's a great emergency fund. Problem is, last year down the road, you only earned 3%. We think we can get you 5%, so let us manage that for you as well. As far as your 401k with no match goes, keep on doing it. When you switch jobs, give us a call. We'll roll your 401k into your IRA, get everything under one roof, maybe save you some breakpoints, save you some fees. And as far as your term life insurance and long-term care insurance goes, gosh, not really what we do. But who are we to say you shouldn't keep doing it? And that is a conversation that I've heard literally dozens and dozens of times. Well, when someone like that walks into my office for the very first time, I see red flags all over the place. For example, I'm not so much concerned with what's in this IRA today. What keeps me awake at night is what this IRA is going to be worth 15 years from now if it grows at 8% per year. It's now worth $1.6 million, folks. Did you know that if you had $1.6 million in your tax-deferred bucket, the required minimum distributions alone would put you in one of the higher marginal tax brackets and literally guarantee that your Social Security will be taxable in perpetuity with all of the compensating spend down that goes along with it? So what we want to do is we want to prevent that IRA from ever getting to 1.6 million, which begs the question, how can you prevent an IRA from growing? And don't anyone say, put it in the stock market. Well, one of my very favorite ways is to do what we call a Roth conversion. How many of you guys have heard of Roth conversion? Okay, so Roth conversion simply says that if you have money sitting in an IRA in the tax-deferred bucket, you can shift it to tax-free so long as you pay what along the way? Taxes. At what rate? And whatever the rate happens to be in the year you do the conversion. So let's say Mr. and Mrs. Jones, they convert their entire IRA all in one year. I wouldn't recommend it. But let's say that they did, and they pay 40% tax. How much tax are they going to pay on that $500,000 conversion? $200,000. So here's the question. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $200,000 just lying around that they can earmark for that tax bill? They don't have it. So what's the rule of thumb, folks? Unless you got a lot of money just languishing in your taxable bucket that you would happily earmark towards a tax on that Roth conversion, I would probably recommend that you wait until 59 and a half before you start thinking about Roth conversions, which of course begs the question, is there any way to get money out of that IRA pre-59 and a half without penalty? Well, at this point, I may bring up that little-known section of the IRS tax code. It's section 72, subsection T. And a 72T says that you can take money out of that IRA pre-59 and a half without penalty so long as you do it in separate, equal, yearly distributions that last for at least 5 years or until 59 and a half, whichever is longer. So let's say Mr. and Mrs. Jones decide to do that 72T. That means they can take out of that IRA each and every year $25,000. They can then shift that to tax-free. Okay, Let's look at those mutual funds. If that's their emergency fund, how do we feel about it? Do they have too much or too little in that emergency fund? What do you think? A little heavy, right? So if they make $100,000 per year, how much should they have in that emergency fund? Probably closer to $50,000. So not only do they have too much, but they're growing it in mutual funds, which means in theory the problem's getting bigger every year. So what we want to do is we want to take the growth on that mutual fund plus some of the principal, and we want to shift it to the tax-free bucket little by little, year by year, such that by the time they reach retirement, they got the perfect amount. I've done the math on this, folks. That would require an annual shift from taxable to tax-free of $6,000 per year. All right, let's take a look at that 401k with no match. The rule of thumb when it comes to 401ks is you put in up to the match, but not 1 penny above and beyond. You do whatever's required to get the free money, and then you move on to the next best thing. Well, if these folks are trying to prevent their IRA from growing by doing a 72T, yet they're putting money hand over fist into their 401k and they're getting no company match, are those two strategies at odds with each other? Yeah, that's a conflicted strategy. So what we want to do is we want to recapture that 10%. 10% of 100,000 is 10,000. We want to shift that to tax-free. And how do we feel about term life insurance and long-term care insurance? We feel like it's incredibly important to mitigate both of those risks, either one of which can really upset your financial apple cart in the years leading up to retirement. But we feel like sometimes, not always sometimes, there can be a better way to accomplish it. So we may recommend that we recapture that money as well. So how much total money did we free up on an annual basis to be able to reposition to tax-free? What does that all add up to? $47,000. Well, usually at this point, someone will say, hey, Dave, not so fast. You don't really have $47,000 freed up. And I'll say, why not? And they'll say, because some of those recommendations that you made are actually taxable events. We just realized an extra $35,000 of taxable income for Mr. and Mrs. Jones. We'll call it 30% tax on the margin. That's $10,500 of additional taxation every year they do this strategy. Let me ask you a question. Do Mr. and Mrs. Jones have $10,500 just lying around that they would love to earmark for that tax bill? So what I may recommend is that they simply pay that tax right out of the $47,000 that we freed up on the previous screen, which means they really have $36,500 to be able to reposition to tax-free. So folks, this is where the rubber hits the road. Where can we put $36,500 per year such that it grows in a truly tax-free way? Well, at this point, I'm going to recommend that they fully fund one of my very favorite tax-free investments, and that's what we call a Roth IRA. How many of you guys have heard of Roth IRAs? Okay. So how much money can two 50-year-olds put into Roth IRAs these days? $7,000 each for a total of $14,000 per year. Why do I like Roth IRAs so much? Because Roth IRAs, so long as you're 59 and a half, you don't pay any of those taxes we talked about. And when you take distributions from your Roth IRA, it does not count as provisional income. It does not count against the thresholds which cause Social Security taxation. Roth IRAs are truly tax-free. So we take that $14,000, we fully fund their Roth IRAs. That leaves us with $22,500 per year to shift to tax-free. Where can we put $22,500 per year such that it grows in a truly tax-free way? Well, at this point, I may bring up a bucket of money that gets treated differently for tax purposes than anything else we've talked about so far. As your money grows, your bucket begins to fill. And the IRS says that the growth on the money in this bucket is going to be treated under a different section of the IRS tax code than anything else we've talked about so far. What does that section of the IRS tax code say? It says that you can touch this money pre-59 and a half without penalty. Can you do that on your IRA or 401k? No, you cannot. They're going to tell you as your money grows, you receive no 1099s. What does that mean? No tax as your money grows. They're going to tell you that when you take the money out, if you take it out the right way, it does not show up as reportable income on your tax return. What does that mean? That means it's tax-free and does not count as provisional income. They're also going to tell you that there are no contribution limits. There are no income limitations. Let me ask you this. Can Bill Gates do a Roth IRA? No. How come? He makes too much money. You start making north of $214,000 of modified adjusted gross income, you can no longer do a Roth IRA. They're also going to tell you that if history serves as a model, there may be no legislative risk. Well, usually right about now, people say, gosh, Dave, this is like the alignment of the stars. This is like the perfect bucket. Why not just put all my money into there? Well, first of all, is it ever a good idea to put all your eggs into any one basket? No, not only that, but the IRS says if we're going to give you the benefit of an unlimited bucket of tax-free dollars, we're going to require that there be a cost of admission. We're going to require that there be a spigot Attached to the side of that bucket through which flows on a monthly basis some expenses. And what do those expenses go towards? Well, they go towards some administrative fees, but they primarily go towards the cost of term life insurance. Now, let me ask you a question. If your house is paid off, your kids have moved out, you're rapidly approaching retirement, is term life insurance really all that high on your wish list? No, it's usually right about now that people start dumping their term life insurance, and the companies that sponsor these programs recognize that, so they've done something to sweeten the pot. They simply say that in the event that somewhere down the road you should need long-term care, they will give you your death benefit while you're alive for the purpose of paying for it. Here's an example. Let's say you got a death benefit of $400,000. You wake up one day, you can no longer feed yourself, bathe yourself, transfer yourself, what have you, any 2 of 6 activities of daily living. You can find one doctor to write one letter to that effect. They will start sending you 25% of that death benefit, or $100,000 per year, every year for 4 years for the purpose of paying for long-term care. Let me ask you this. How many of you guys have looked into traditional long-term care insurance? Okay, is it cheap? No, it's getting more and more expensive all the time. Can it be hard to qualify? Yeah, you might live to be 120, but if you have a bad back, a bad hip, a bad knee, you may not even get accepted. And what happens if you pay for 30 years? And die peaceful in your sleep, never having used it? Do they send you all your money back at the end? No, it goes to pay for someone else's benefit. And that can be a source of heartburn for a lot of different people because nobody wants to pay for something they hope they never have to use. Why is this different? This is different because if you die peaceful in your sleep 30 years from now, never having needed long-term care, someone's still getting a death benefit, probably your kids. So there isn't that sensation of having paid for something you hope you never have to use. What do we call this bucket? We call it the LIRP. What does that stand for? It stands for Life Insurance Retirement Plan. Why life insurance? Because the IRS says in order for this bucket to work, you got to be willing to pay for some life insurance. You got to have a need for life insurance. Why retirement plan? Because one of the ancillary goals of this bucket is to build money up so that somewhere down the road you can take money out and spend it on your lifestyle at a period in time when tax rates are likely to be dramatically higher than they are today. All right, before we go any further, I've got a very important question to ask. And it's simply this. If you could be in any tax bracket in retirement, any tax bracket of your choosing, which tax bracket would you pick? 0. Well, if what Mr. and Mrs. Jones want is to be in the 0% tax bracket, tell me how they're doing so far. They're going to have money coming out of their Roth IRAs so long as they're 59.5 when they take that money out. Will they pay tax? They will not pay tax. They're going to have a lot of money coming out of their LIRP. Regardless of how old they are when they take the money out, will they pay tax? No tax. Now, let's go back to that IRA. You remember the IRA? The goal in doing the 72T was simply to prevent that IRA from getting any bigger. If we did a good job of preventing that IRA from getting any bigger, how much money should still be in that IRA by the time they reach 65? $500,000. So here's my question for you. If at age 65, they have an IRA that's worth $500,000, is there any way that they can take money out of there, spend it on their lifestyle, not pay tax, and it's got to be legal? Remember, if you retire today, absent any other deductions, the IRS gives you a deduction. What do we call that deduction? A standard deduction, which if you retire today as a married couple is $25,900. What does that mean? That means you can experience income up to, from any number of sources, up to $25,900 without paying any tax at all. Does the IRS index that number to keep up with inflation? You bet they do, by 3% per year. So by the time they reach 65, their standard deduction is going to be much closer to $40,350, which begs the question, if at age 65 they have a standard deduction of $40,350, how much could they take out of their IRA without paying any tax at all? That's right, $40,350. Folks, what's the moral of the story? So long as you only take out up to whatever your standard deduction happens to be in any given year, you now have an IRA that's 100% tax-free. And if you have tax-free, 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 and you can stay below your provisional income thresholds, what do you suppose happens to their Social Security? That's right, tax-free. And if you have tax-free, 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 what tax bracket does that put you in? 0%. Folks, why do I make such a big deal about being in the 0% tax bracket? Well, if we can't get you to the 0% tax bracket, what's the next best tax bracket? And don't anyone say 1. That's right, it goes all the way up to 10, throw in another 6% for state. Now we're talking 16. And if what David Walker says comes true and tax rates have to double to keep our country solvent, what happens to the 16? That's right, 32. All of a sudden, second place isn't looking all that great. Now, I love it when things make sense conceptually, but I love it even more when they make sense mathematically. So what I did for Mr. and Mrs. Jones is what's called a before and after comparison. I simply said, hey, if Mr. and Mrs. Jones never met me, and they kept on doing exactly what they were doing, and they didn't change a thing, how much money would they be able to spend after tax? And according to my math, they'd be able to spend just shy of $4.4 million after tax. And I know what you're thinking, that sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. The problem is they run out of money at age 85, at which point they can either die or move in with their kids. Conversely, if they do everything we talked about, we get them the 0% tax bracket, get their Social Security tax-free, they can now spend almost $8 million. They never run out of money, and they still have about $1.4 million left over at age 100. More importantly, what happens to the blue column if tax rates double? Does it get bigger or smaller? It gets smaller. What happens to the gray column if tax rates double? It stays exactly the same. Why? Because if you're in the 0% tax bracket and tax rates double, 2 times 0 is still 0. Folks, that is what we call the power of 0. Thank you very much.